Okay, so let's dive in and talk about recurrent neural networks. And so recurrent neural networks at a high level, this is sort of like an analog in some sense for convolutional neural networks for sequence data. And the idea being similar, right? That we're going to try to exploit some structure about the data that's coming into the model. In this case, the fact that the data is coming in a sequence to build a more efficient neural net architecture. Hang on a second. All right, so what we're going to cover today, first we'll talk about sequence problems and just what are some of the types of problems you can solve with these architectures. Then we'll talk about recurrent neural networks, which are the main family of architectures we'll be talking about today. And we'll talk about some of the problems with recurrent neural networks and some of the solutions that people have come up with to address those problems. And we'll do a case study on machine translation, and we'll talk about how one of the earlier neural machine translation systems from Google worked. And I imagine this is probably still not how it works, because these days everything is transformers, which we'll talk about next week. Then we'll talk about the CTC loss, which is a loss function that's useful for sequence problems that we'll be using in the lab. We'll talk about some of the pros and cons of recurrent neural network architectures as opposed to some other choices that you have. And then finally, we'll do a very quick preview of non-recurrent models for sequences. And then next week will be all about that. Okay, so sequence problems, like what are we even talking about here? So simple example of a sequence problem that you can have as a mental model is time series forecasting, right? And so in time series forecasting, the input to your model is a time series, so a history of a value of some data point, and your goal in this task is to predict what the next value is going to be. So the input is a sequence and the output is a single value. You can also do this with other types of data other than just time series. So for example, you can have the input sequence be text and then predict the sentiment. But sequence models can also handle cases where the output is not just a single value. The output is itself a sequence. So for example, in translation, the input to your model is a sequence of text, and the output is the sequence of text in another language. Similarly, speech generation, speech recognition and speech generation, your input is, say, an audio waveform, and your output is maybe the text that is contained in that audio waveform. But sequences don't have to just be the input of models. Like you can have problems where your input is a single value or a single vector, and then your output is a sequence of maybe variable length. So, for example, you can generate music using sequence models. You can caption images, right? So you can take a single image as an output, which you can view as a sequence, or you can view as just a single input, and then you can output a description, which is a sequence. Or in question answering, it's maybe another example, right, where your question is some text, or your input is some text, and your output is a subset of the text that went into it. Okay, so there's kind of a few broad groupings of sequence problems that we saw on the previous slide. So one is one-to-many, where you have a single output or a single input, and then the output of your model is a sequence of outputs. There's many-to-one problems, where the input to the model is a sequence of inputs, but there's a single output. And then there are many-to-many problems, where the input to your model is a sequence, and the output is also a sequence, maybe of different length. And so we'll talk about how to use kind of a similar architectural structure to solve all of these types of problems. Okay, so one question I think is worth asking, just like we asked in the ConvNet lecture, is why not just use feed-forward networks to solve these problems? So one way you could do that is if you have, like let's say you're solving a many-to-many problem, which is the most general case. Maybe you have 3 inputs. You could concatenate those inputs, pass those through a fully connected network to an output, and then you could reshape that output so it has the shape that you eventually want. One problem with this is that this doesn't really handle sequences of arbitrary length well. One way to deal with this problem is you can pad sequences to the max length, right? So you can add kind of empty characters in the sequence if the sequence is shorter than the max length that you allow. But one challenge with this is that the memory requirement for doing this computation scales linearly in the number of time steps. right? So if you increase the max length of the sequence, then the matrix that you need to multiply with also increases in size. And so this is kind of undesirable scaling property for this type of model. But maybe more importantly than that, this matrix that's mapping your flattened sequence to your outputs is maybe overkill in some sense. Right? And so the way to think about that is, what is this matrix doing? Right. So this matrix is learning a mapping from every single dimension in your input to every single dimension in your output. And in particular, if there's some pattern that you're trying to recognize in your sequence, so to give you an example, maybe a particular word is somehow correlated with the output that you're trying to produce, then that model will need to learn weights for that particular pattern at every single position in the sequence independently, right? And so it's, in some sense, it's very data inefficient, because if you're trying, if having the word cat in your sentence is very predictive of the output, then you need to see examples in the input where cat is at every single position. And so this kind of ignores some fundamental nature of the problem, some structure that we expect the inputs to this model have, which is patterns that repeat themselves over time. Okay, so the next thing we'll talk about is kind of the core type of model that we'll be focusing on today, and how this addresses the issue that we pointed out in sequence problems. The main idea behind recurrent neural networks is that instead of having a single massive matrix that you multiply that has independent weights for every position in the sequence, instead we're going to do stateful computation. And so what this looks like is the output that your model produces depends on the input to the model at the current time step in the sequence, as well as some state that the model maintains over time. And so at each time step, when you're fed a new input to the model, what you produce is you produce the output for that time step, as well as the next hidden state for the model. One way to make this a little bit more concrete is to look at how this rolls out over time. So before the first time step, you have some starting hidden state for your model. So that's H0 in this diagram. Then at the first time step, you receive the first input. And your model computes, given H0 and the first input X1, it computes the first output Y1, as well as the first, or really the second hidden state H1. And that at each subsequent time step, it performs the same calculation. So using the same neural network weights, it takes the input that it sees at that time step and whatever the value of the previous hidden state is, and it uses that to produce the next hidden state and the next output. So what does this look like in code? Let's focus first on the bottom function here. And so this function step is the function that gets called every single time the model sees a new input. And so what the model does is it first computes the next hidden value, and we'll come back in a second to how it does that. But for now, just think of that as a black box. And then it uses that hidden value and matrix multiplies it with a set of weights to produce the output for the model. Okay, so now let's focus on this, how this compute next H function works. So the way the compute next H function works is this thing in the top function here, which is kind of like this tan H of the sum of two matrix multiplications. And so to make this a little bit more concrete, this is what's going on in compute next H. So you have two inputs to this function. One is a property of this class, which is the previous hidden state ht minus 1. And then the second is the input at this timestamp xt. And the way that this function works is it takes each of those inputs and matrix multiplies it with a separate weight matrix that is a property of this recurrent neural network layer. And so this this H this NH dimensional hidden vector gets multiplied with a NH by NH dimensional matrix. And then this NX dimensional model input gets multiplied by a NH by NX dimensional weight matrix. And so the outputs of both of those matrix multiplications are both NH dimensional. And so we can add those two outputs together and then pass the output through an activation function of some kind, which in the most basic recurrent neural network state is a tanh. So coming back here, the way that we compute the next hidden state is that we perform two matrix multiplications, one with the previous hidden state and one with the input vector x. We add those together and then we wrap them in an activation function like tanh. And so this is really all you need to know for like the most basic kind of recurrent neural network that you can create. Okay, and so one thing to note about this is the way that this model works is that we're calling the step function every time we have an input in the sequence. And at each of those inputs, it produces a different output. So this model, as we've laid it out so far, works well when you have many-to-many problems that are aligned, right? So where you want to produce exactly one output for each input to the model. But in general, that's not always what you want to do. So the next case that we'll talk about is how to use this type of recurrent neural network to solve many-to-one problems, right? So where instead of having an output at each input, we instead have one output at the end of the sequence. And so again, like expanding this a little bit, what we're going to do is we're going to take this last output value yt, and then we're going to use that to produce the output for the entire sequence. So again, this output value yt is kind of the state at the last time step, and that's what we're going to use to compute the value for the entire sequence. So more concretely, like if the input to your recurrent neural network is some text, like let's say a review, then you could pass that text to an RNN, which we'll call an encoder, and then we'll look at the last output. And so the last output is just a vector. Then we could pass that vector to a classifier, which you could also call a decoder, and that classifier will produce the single value that you want to output, which is in this case the sentiment, positive or negative, of the sequence. And so this is kind of one case of a more general architectural pattern called encoder-decoder architectures. And encoder-decoder architectures are kind of the architectural pattern that we'll study in this lecture. So we talked about the general kind of recurrent neural network setup, and we talked about how to use recurrent neural networks to solve many-to-one problems. And we talked about kind of this architectural pattern, which is having sort of one network that serves as an encoder that maps your input to a single vector, and then a separate network that maps that vector to your output. And now we'll talk about how to use this encoder-decoder architecture to solve one-to-many problems. So one example of a one-to-many problem that you might want to solve is we take as an input an image of something that's happening, and we want our model to output some text that describes what's going on in that image. So one way to solve that problem using recurrent neural networks and an encoder-decoder architecture is you can start by mapping that input through some encoder, which in the case of the input being an image might be a convnet. And then instead of having that convnet map all the way to the classification of the image, you can take one of the vectors from the last couple of fully connected layers. And so this is your hidden state of the model. And so this vector now can be now can serve as the initial hidden state for your recurrent neural network that's used to generate the text that describes this image. One other thing to note here is thinking of this as an encoder-decoder architecture and thinking of the encoder and decoder as separate networks is really like mental heuristic for understanding the architecture. The networks aren't really separate in any meaningful sense, right? So and in particular, they're connected during backpropagation. So when you train an architecture like this, your loss function propagates all the way from the output back through the decoder to the hidden state, and then back from the hidden state all the way through the weights in your encoder. Okay, so let's zoom in on this example a little bit and make it slightly more concrete. So we've taken our input image, we've passed it through a convnet, we're looking at one of the last couple of hidden layers, and that's a vector. So then we're going to just use that vector to we're gonna treat that vector as the initial hidden state of the RNN, and then we're basically just going to pass the rest of the and then we're going to continue propagating that RNN forward. And one thing to note here is, in the previous examples we've seen, there's always been an input X at each step. And so, like, one question you might have is, what is the input to each step in the sequence in an image captioning model? And the answer is, there's like kind of one trick that's pretty common for these architectures that are generating sequences, which is you just feed the last output of the model back as the input at the next timestamp. So in this example, these Ys are playing the role both of the output of the model as well as the input of the next step of the model. And then there's one other trick to be aware of here for how these recurrent neural network decoder architectures work, and that's how do you know, like, if the input of your model is just the output of the previous step, how do you know when to stop generating, right? Like, there's always a new input because it's just the output of the previous step. And so the way that we often deal with that is by adding a special character to your vocabulary. And that character plays the role of telling the generator that, okay, now it's time to stop generating new characters. All right, so in terms of how you could train something like this, the simplest thing that could work is you could have a label for each step in the sequence, which is the true sentence that describes this output. And then the loss function that you'd use is for each of those outputs, that's a character. And so you can take a cross-entry loss between that, between the predicted character and the actual character in the sequence. And then to form the loss function for your entire model, you can just sum all of those cross-entropy loss terms together. And so that's something differentiable that you can backprop through the entire sequence and train your model that way. So there's some problems with using this as a loss function, and later on in the lecture we'll talk about a better loss function for these types of sequence models. All right, so we've talked about how to use this encoder-decoder pattern to do many-to-one problems and to do one-to-many problems. So now pretty natural extension is to apply this to the most general case, where the input to the model is a sequence and the output to the model is also a sequence. But the sequences are not necessarily the same length. So for example, the example that we'll talk about for the next little while is machine translation. So in machine translation, you take an input, which is a sequence of characters in one language. So a sequence of characters that form words in English. And then the goal is to predict how that sentence should translate to another language like French. And the kind of baseline architecture that we're going to talk about here is an encoder-decoder architecture, where both the encoder and the decoder are both recurrent neural networks. So to zoom in on this a little bit, what this might look like is you start at time t=0 with the hidden state of the encoder network. Then at each time step, at each of the values of the input sequence, so the sentence in English, you you combine that input with the previous hidden state to produce the next hidden state. Then at the end of that sentence, you take the final hidden state and you use that as the initial hidden state for the decoder network. So the decoder network starts with an initial hidden state that's created by the encoder network, and then it does a similar recurrent decoding scheme that we saw in the last section. So at each step, it takes the output of the previous step as input, combines that with the previous hidden state to produce the next output. So for the next few minutes, we'll talk about some of the challenges with using this type of architecture to solve translation problems. And we'll talk about some of the ways that people have improved on recurrent neural networks to address those problems. And so just to give you a little bit of a preview, one of the problems with this setup is that you have this sentence, and the sentence might be really long, but all of the information about what the first sentence means needs to be encoded in this in the only thing that's passed between the encoder and the decoder, which is this, the initial hidden state of the decoder. And so, in practice, you'll choose the dimensionality of that hidden state in advance. So maybe that's 128 dimensional. And then no matter how long your input sequence is, all of the information that's contained in that input sequence needs to somehow fit into that 128 dimensional vector. And so that's kind of the intuition for some of the problems with this encoder-decoder architecture for a more complex problem with potentially longer input sequences like machine translation. All right. So before we get into the case study, the next thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to upgrade our mental model for how a recurrent neural network works from kind of the simplest possible RNN setup that we described before to one that is actually more commonly used in practice called the LSTM. All right, so let's to motivate the LSTM, let's talk about some of the things that we might want in a recurrent neural network architecture. So one goal is we want to be able to handle long sequences of input data. And in particular, along those long sequences, we want to be able to connect events from the past to outcomes in the future. So, another way of describing this is long-term dependencies. And an example of what I mean here is if you have a sentence and you're trying to describe what happens in the sentence, at the end of the sentence, even if that sentence is really long, you might need to be able to remember a name of a character, like a character in a novel that occurred at the beginning of the sentence. So you need to be able to connect events in the future, like what is a summary of maybe this entire novel, to things that happened near the beginning of the sequence. So we need to be able to handle long-term dependencies. In reality, the recurrent neural network model that we described before does not do a very good job of handling long sequences. So in practice, kind of anything be more than like 10 or 20 time steps tends not to work very well with vanilla RNNs. And longer term dependencies really get lost. And so the reason why is this idea of vanishing gradients. So to explain what vanishing gradients do and why those prevent long-term dependencies from working, first we'll talk about a little bit about how we actually backpropagate a loss function in recurrent neural networks. And so I'm going to go through this piece relatively quickly. So if you're not familiar with it, it's worth reading up a little bit on backpropagation through time. But the main thing that you need to know is that backpropagation through time works exactly the same as regular backpropagation. You just have to sort of unroll the entire graph across time before you do your backpropagation steps. And so in particular, if we're trying to study the gradient of the loss function with respect to some of the weights of our network, then the first thing that we need to do is we need to study the gradient of the loss function with respect to the hidden state of the recurrent neural network. And then we'll pass that gradient backward. We'll combine it with the gradient of the previous hidden state with respect to the current hidden state, and then we'll use that combined gradient to find the gradient of the loss function with respect to the model weights. And so the observation to make here, without going into all the details about how this works, is that the gradient of your loss function with respect to the weights that describe the transition between the previous hidden state and then the current hidden state depend on the gradients of the gradient between subsequent hidden states in the model. And so if you'll recall in kind of the vanilla recurrent neural network setup that we had, the way that we computed the next hidden state from the previous hidden state was by this tanh of a sum of two matrix multiplications. And so when you're computing this factor of this gradient of subsequent hidden states, then each time you do that, that introduces a gradient of a tanh, so tanh prime, into your into the gradient with respect to that hidden state. And so the problem with this is that if you look at the derivatives of common activation functions, here's a plot of sort of the three most common activation functions as a function of the value of the input to those functions. And so in particular, both tanh and sigmoid have derivatives that are very close to zero when the values that are going into them are large. And so what tends to happen in practice is that you have relatively large inputs to that tanh prime that produces an output that's close to zero, and the magnitude of the gradient, where you have all of these tanh primes multiplied by each other, eventually hits zero in numerical precision. And so after enough gradients, enough timestamps, the gradients are just too small. And so one question you might ask is, well, what about ReLUs, right? Like ReLUs have a gradient that's equal to 1 anytime the input is positive. And the answer there is that ReLU RNNs in practice often have the opposite problem, which is exploding gradients, right? So if you have many time steps, then gradients tend to get too big. All right, so next thing that we're going to cover is LSTMs. And so when people talk about recurrent neural networks in practice, usually what they're talking about is LSTMs or some variant on LSTMs. And so the key idea behind LSTMs is to change our compute next stage function. And so instead of using the simple compute next stage function that we used in the previous examples, we're going to use something that is a little bit more complicated, but helps in some way preserve gradients over time. And so what I'm going to do in the next few slides is I'm going to introduce you at a high level to how you can think about the architecture of what's going on inside of an LSTM unit, but won't go through all the details. But again, hopefully this will give you some intuition about how they work, and then you can fill in the details on your own later. So the main idea behind LSTMs is that in addition to having this hidden state that gets updated at every time step, we introduce this new state that also gets passed from time step to timestamp, called a cell state. And that cell state has very particular rules about how it gets updated at every time step. And so in particular, there's kind of three main interactions that the hidden state has with the cell state. So the first interaction is that is called the forget gate. And so at a rough level, the function of this forget gate is to decide which parts of the old cell state we want to get rid of as a result of seeing this new input to the model. And so the way this works is you take the previous hidden state, you combine that with the input to the model, and then you pass that through a sigmoid. So that produces a value between 0 and 1 for each of the dimensions of the cell state. And then when you element-wise multiply that with the cell state, each of the values of the cell state is either mapped to 0 or left the same or scaled somewhere in between. And so what this gate helps you do is kind of get rid of old information that no longer needs to be in the cell state. The next component of the LSTM is the input gate. And so this decides like how to actually incorporate new information into the cell state. So the way this works is you, again, take as an input the inputs to the model as well as the previous hidden state. You map those through a tanh to produce values between -1 and 1. And you combine those with values that are the output of a sigmoid. And so together you get a new vector that you just add to the previous value of the cell state. So you've incorporated new information. And then the last step is how do you actually produce the next hidden state? And so the way that you produce the next hidden state is that you, again, you combine the current input, the previous hidden state, you sigmoid that, and then you tanh the value of the cell state, multiply that by that value between 0 and 1, and then that's passed to the next time step and to the output as the hidden state for this time step. Okay, so there's a lot going on there, a lot of moving pieces, and like in particular, you might be wondering, well, why does this actually solve our problem? And to answer those questions, I'm happy to talk more about this as well, but I would actually highly recommend reading this blog post from Chris Ola, which I think is kind of the most clear explanation for how LSTMs work and why they solve this problem. But hopefully this gives you a little bit of intuition about what's happening under the hood. So one other thing you might have heard of if you're like reading machine learning papers is like GRUs and other alternative recurrent neural network architectures. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. Like, is there something better than the LSTM out there? Two papers that I like that explored this question. These are both empirical papers where they compare different variants of the LSTM, including GRU. So in the first one, they compared 9 LSTM variants on 3 data sets and concluded, empirically, it's kind of hard to beat a regular LSTM in terms of like overall performance across different data sets. A later paper went even deeper into this question. So instead of just comparing like a measly 9 LSTM variants, they used neural architecture search to generate 10,000 architectural variants. They compared those architectural variants on 3 different data sets, and they concluded that GRUs actually tend to perform a little bit better than LSTMs. And they also found some architectures that they made up using this procedure that performed a little bit better than GRUs. And so what should you take away from this, right? Like, should you be using GRUs? Should you be using LSTMs? Should you be using like some other architecture? So our advice here is LSTMs, if you're going to use recurrent neural network architecture, which maybe not that many people do anymore, but if you're going to, they tend to work very well for a wide variety of tasks. And GRUs might be a little bit better, might be a little bit easier to train. And so if your trusty LSTM doesn't seem to be performing well, then you could also give GRUs a try. But if you're starting to dive deeper into recurrent neural network units than that, then maybe there's a bigger problem in how you're setting up your problem. Up next is we're going to talk more about machine translation. We're going to introduce 2 ideas. One is bidirectionality, and the other is attention. So these are sort of the big ideas to take away from this section. And this is all from this one paper from back in 2016. So at one point, this was running in production at Google. Highly doubt that it is anymore, but it's worth knowing about anyway. So one thing I want to talk about is just, in general, if you're like reading machine learning application papers, what are the questions that you might want to ask yourself to understand what's going on in these papers? So here are some questions that I think are worth asking. One is just like, first of all, what is the problem that they're trying to solve? So what are they using the neural network for? Then what model architecture are they using to solve the problem? How are they training that model architecture? So what is the loss function and what is the data set that's trained on? And how do they actually perform training? And then finally, since we're thinking about applications of machine learning here, the last question that I think is very much worth considering is how inference works for this model. So are there any tricks that you need in order to do inference on this model in production? So starting from the problem, again, we're working on machine translation. So the goal is to translate a sentence from one language to another. And the architecture that they use is motivated by the same encoder-decoder architecture that we talked about earlier. And again, this is kind of how this would work if this is how this would look if this is all they did, like encoder-decoder with a regular LSTM. But there's some problems with just doing a single layer LSTM as your machine translation model. And one of the biggest problems is that this is just going to underfit this task pretty badly. So one thing that you could try is you can try stacking LSTM layers. And so this is a diagram of what this looks like. You have multiple LSTMs. Each LSTM is reading from the LSTM before it, as well as its own previous hidden state to produce the next hidden state, which is the input to the next LSTM. But stacked LSTMs are hard to train. So this is a quote from the paper, which says that they were able to get them to work pretty well up to 4 layers. And by the time you got up to 8 layers, this is just very unwieldy. So one solution here is to add something similar to a ResNet here. So to add residual connections. And again, this works very similarly to how it does in a ResNet, where between the layers of the LSTM, you have this skip connection. So the input to the LSTM at the first layer is passed directly via sum to the LSTM in the second layer, in addition to the output of the first LSTM layer. So that's one way to make it easier to train these large stacks of LSTMs. There's another problem though, and this is one that we alluded to earlier, right? And so the problem is that when you're encoding an entire sentence, there's a lot of information that has to be encoded in that last time step. So there's a bottleneck here. There's an information bottleneck between the encoder and the decoder. And so the solution that they use is a class of techniques called attention, which we'll be talking a lot about next week. But the key idea behind attention is that instead of compressing all of the previous time steps into a single hidden state, instead you want to give the decoder access to the entire history of time steps. But that's a lot of information for the decoder to take into account. And so we're really only going to pay attention to a subset of those pass vectors. So to make this a little bit more concrete, let's say that we're translating a sentence from English to French. And let's ask the question about which parts of the sentence in English do we really care about when we're predicting each character in the French sentence, right? So maybe for the first word in the French sentence, we only really care about the first few words in the English sentence. And for the second word, maybe we care about the same words. Maybe for this third word, this means brown in French. So our network might only really care about the word brown in English to translate this word, and so on. And so one way we can formalize this into something that we can build into a network is instead of having a subset of the input to the model that we pay attention to produce the output, instead we're going to have a distribution over all of the inputs to the model. And so the way that we're going to compute the attention value for this particular word in the sentence is we're going to use some relevance scores. And these relevance scores tell us how relevant each word in the input sentence is to this particular word in the output sentence. So there's a couple questions that this brings up. One is okay, how do we actually compute these relevance scores? And then the second is, how do we use the relevance scores to compute the value of this word that we're trying to predict? So let's focus on the second question first. So the way that you use relevance scores in an attention setup is that you compute a relevance score for each of, in many cases, the way that this works is you compute a relevance score for each of the hidden values in the recurrent neural network encoder. So each of those hidden states is given a relevance weight P sub I. And then the way that you use those is you produce an attention score that combines all of those hidden values in a weighted sum according to the relevance scores. And then that weighted sum is passed as another input into the next prediction task that the model has to do. So you're using something in the decoder to compute some relevance scores for each hidden state in the encoder. Then you're combining all the hidden states in the encoder via a weighted sum, which is weighted by the relevance scores, and you're passing that as another input to the decoder. So this is what it looks like over time. So one thing that you can do to build a little bit more intuition for what's going on in attention models is you can look at attention maps. And so these are basically ways of visualizing the weight that each of the input, the parts of the input sequence have on prediction of a particular word, in this case, in the output sentence. And so this is one way of visualizing it. So for example, like, this French word, this means agreement in French, I guess. And so you can see that the weight is almost entirely on agreement in the English sentence. But some of these other words like this, let's find one that's more interesting than that. But like this French word, for example, kind of depends equally on both this English word and this English word. So the model is paying attention to both of these things, almost equally. Another way to visualize this for sequences is you can plot this on a heat map. And so the cells on the heat map, these are the outputs of the model. The cells on the heat map, lighter colors correspond to more weight being placed on that row. This is another way to visualize what's happening in the attention inside of a network. And then the other thing I'll mention on attention is just attention is useful in many machine learning problems, not just translation. Turning like a raw audio waveform into the text that's contained in that, that's being spoken in that waveform. These models often use attention. And it's not just for like what you would think of traditionally as sequence models either, right? It's also often used in image models. So if you're like, for example, like if you're doing this task of trying to describe what's in an image, so encoding the image and then decoding it to produce a sentence that describes what's happening in the image, then one thing that you can do is you can add an attention mechanism to that allows the decoder to pay attention to certain parts of the image. And so this is visualized here where, this is the image that was an input. This is the output that the model produced. And here's a visualization where the lighter parts of the image are the parts of the image that the model paid more attention to when it's producing its outputs. Okay, so this is kind of where we're at with this this model architecture. So we have this stacked LSTM and we have this attention module that's allowing the decoder to communicate more with the encoder. Another problem with LSTMs is they only consider backward context. So why is that a problem? Well, when you're translating a sentence, and you're deciding how to translate the word quick, quick can mean different things in different contexts. So understanding how the rest of the sentence is going to unfold might be important to deciding how you translate the sentence. So the simple idea that you can use to make order not matter, or like directionality not matter in the sentence, is to use two separate LSTMs, one to process the sentence in the forward order, and then the other to process the sentence in backward order. So this is called a bidirectional LSTM. And so what this looks like is you have sentence, you have an LSTM, and then you have a separate LSTM that is processing the same sentence, but it's the hidden states move in the opposite direction. And then at the output, you just concatenate those two inputs and pass it on to the next layer. And so this is briefly what this looks like in the architecture. Okay, what loss function was used and what data set it was trained on and all this stuff I'll skip over, but worth taking a look at those in the paper. All right, so to summarize, the way that this kind of like early landmark results in machine translation worked was they it's built off of this recurrent neural network encoder-decoder architecture that we talked about at the beginning, but with some improvements. So instead of RNNs, it's LSTMs. Instead of a single LSTM, it's stacked LSTMs with residual connections and an attention mechanism that's added to it so that longer term connections can form. And then to encode future information, we also made this model bidirectional. And it's trained using a standard cross-entropy loss on a large data set. And there's some tricks that they use to speed up inference and training. But that's the recipe for training a state-of-the-art neural machine translation system as of 2016 or 2017. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is what's called the CTC loss. So what's the goal of CTC loss? So in some of the labs, one of the problems that we're going to be working on is taking some handwritten text and turning that into what is the text in this handwriting. So the input is like kind of an image of a line of text, and then the output is a sentence. So the question is, how would you actually model this, right? So based on what we talked about before, one way you could do this is you could have an encoder-decoder architecture, right? Where the encoder takes a particular window in that sentence, passes it through a convnet, passes the output of the convnet to an LSTM. That LSTM produces a character, and then we use that character as like what is the character at that position in the convnet. And so in an ideal world, what this could look like is, we slide this convnet window over this input image, and at each position that we slide it over, we combine the output of that convnet with the previous hidden state of the LSTM. We produce the character that we expect to see at this position on the image. So in a perfect world, this just works great and we're done. The problem is, like, what if we're dealing with an input that's scaled differently? So we might even take the same sentence and just stretch it out more. And then, like, let's see what happens if we try to apply the same window size to this problem. Well, as we slide this convnet window, for the first two positions that that convolutional filter is being slid over, it's looking at the same character. So we might produce the same character twice. And the same thing might happen like in different parts of the sentence. So the question is, like, how do we deal with the fact that the inputs and outputs might be scaled differently, or they might be misaligned? And so more generally, like, this kind of misalignment problem can happen in lots of different sequence-to-sequence problems. And and throughout this, I'll be using images from this blog post below that covers the CTC loss in more details. And so, again, would recommend checking that out if you want to understand a little bit better how this is working. But the intuition for the solution is, let's say that we take some input and we slide our window over that input and we produce some characters in the output. But those characters, we might have repeated characters there. The intuition for how the CTC loss works is, like, if we see a character, C or A 2 times in a row, then let's just assume that that corresponds to the same character in the output sentence. And so we'll combine subsequent characters that have the same value. And so in this case, like, we'd combine the 2 C's, we'd combine the 3 A's, and we produce the output that we want. One problem with this is, how do we deal with sentences that actually do have, are like supposed to have two of the same letter in a row? And so that's kind of the one extra wrinkle that we'll add to the CTC loss. And that's that we add these kind of extra epsilon tokens as one of the possible things that the model could output. So the way this works is, we'll slide our window over the entire sentence. We'll produce the, and then the model will produce either a character or an epsilon token. And then we'll have a rule for how we merge characters and epsilon tokens together in order to produce the final output sentence. And so the rules that we'll follow are, the first thing that we'll do is we'll merge all repeated characters. And then we'll remove any epsilon tokens, and the remaining characters are the output. And so the reason that this solves our problem is that if you actually want to output two of the same character in a row, then all the model has to do is, instead of outputting those two characters in a row in the raw outputs, instead has to output the character and then epsilon and then the character. And then our merging rules allow us to have those two characters that remain at the end. So there's more technical details that are important to know here if you actually want to implement and train this. For example, how do we know this is actually differentiable? Or how do we make it differentiable? And again, refer you to this great blog post for when you want to understand those details. But yeah, this is kind of like what this works like, what this looks like when you're decoding a raw input sequence. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second for lab 3, because we'll actually implement CTC loss for our RNN model. I want to talk quickly about some of the pros and cons of the neural net architectures that we've been talking about so far today. What are some of the pros? Well, one of the pros of these recurrent neural net architectures is that, which hopefully is clear from some of the examples that we looked at. But this architectural pattern, this encoder-decoder pattern with LSTMs or stacked bidirectional LSTMs with attention or whatever variant of your recurrent neural network you want, as either the input or the encoder or the decoder or both, it's a very flexible architectural pattern, and it can solve a lot of different problems, right? So it works for one-to-many problems, it works for many-to-one problems, and it works for many-to-many problems, even if the inputs and outputs are misaligned. And another pro is that there's kind of a long history of these models being successful in NLP and other applications. And for a long time, really like up until 2019, is that right? Most of the like state-of-the-art sequence applications used some variant of a recurrent neural network architecture. But really since 2018, 2019, almost all of those applications have been replaced with transformers and variants of transformers, which is what we'll be talking about next week. So what are the cons? Well, recurrent neural network training is inherently not as parallelizable as other types of models. And the reason for that is that you need to go in sequence, right? So in order to know what the value of the the hidden state at like the end of the sequence is, you first need to compute the hidden states in all of the previous steps in the sequence. And so there's something that's inherently sequential about that. And so parallelism is one of the things that makes training larger and larger models more feasible. So we have somehow less parallelism in recurrent networks than we do in other types of networks. And so in practice, these things tend to be a lot slower to train. And in practice, they're also often very finicky to train. So LSTMs and other RNN variants tend to require a lot of tuning. And there's a lot of tricks that goes into training these things well. So it's not a particularly easy thing to just kind of pick up and start working with off the shelf. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about in this section is just a quick preview of what Sergey is going to talk about next week, which is non-recurrent sequence models. So the first insight here is that just because you're working with sequence data doesn't necessarily mean that you need to use a recurrent neural network model. And so today we're going to look at a convolutional approach to sequence data. And next week, as I mentioned, we'll expand and talk about transformers. And so the approach that we'll discuss is from this paper, which was a early success in generating raw audio, and at least for a while was used in Google Assistant and Google Cloud text to speech. And I wonder if it still is, or if it's just like Google is transformers all the way down these days. I'm not sure. But for at least a few years, this was used in production. And so the main idea that's introduced here is convolutional sequence models. So again, what problem are we trying to solve here? In the WaveNet model, the problem that they're trying to solve is taking some input text. So what do you want the model to say? And then outputting an audio waveform of speaking that text. So you want to produce some like realistic sounding speech of the model reading that text aloud. What model architecture is used? So again, our baseline model architecture is this RNN encoder-decoder architecture. But there's some limitations to LSTMs that make audio modeling difficult. And these are some of the same limitations that we've talked about before, right? So long-term dependencies and this bottleneck of sequential training. And so in audio data in particular, you tend to have like very, very long sequences. So the insight that was applied in this paper is that convolutions are not just for images. Convolutions can be applied to sequences as well. So the way to visualize this is kind of like this, right? So at each time step in the input, you map kind of a history of time steps, so a window of time steps to produce the next input in the next layer of the model. And then that layer also takes a window of time steps to produce the next layer and so on. And so this is what this looks like, right? So for a particular output, the way it's produced is by looking at a window of the previous hidden layer. And each of those inputs from the previous hidden layer is produced from a window of inputs in the hidden layer before that, all the way back down to the input layer. One other detail to note here is typically in convolutions, you think of so the question is like, where do we sample this window from? And this particular scheme that's used in this paper and for a lot of sequence modeling problems is called a causal convolution. The reason it's called a causal convolution is that the entire window is sampled from the past. So you're not looking at any data in the future in order to produce the output at the next hidden layer. And the reason that's important is because when you're sampling from this model, right? So when someone is typing text into the model in real time, we want to be able to also produce the output in real time. So we don't want to be able to look into the future and see what the person is going to type next in order to produce the sound at this time step. And yeah, so this is kind of like the math behind how causal convolution works. Again, it's just a weighted sum of values in a window of input values. So one challenge with models like this is getting a large enough receptive field, right? So just like in some of the other sequence problems that we talked about, in text-to-speech, one thing that that matters is that like the output waveform at a particular time step might not just depend on a very, very small, like narrow window of text around that time step. It might also depend on things that were said or things that were typed in the distant past, because those might have an influence, for example, on like the inflection that you use when you say a particular word. And so one of the challenges is how do we actually increase the receptive field of a particular output in this model? The approach here is to use, just like we talked about dilated convolutions for computer vision applications, there's also a notion of dilated convolutions in the one-dimensional world. So these are called dilated causal convolutions. And the way it works is similar to how dilation works in image models, where instead of sampling subsequent inputs in the previous hidden layer to produce the next output, you instead skip some inputs. So you instead of looking at like the value at the current time step and the value at the previous time step, you might look at the value at the current time step and then the time step that was like n time steps ago. And so this is kind of one of the other key ideas that made this paper work. So there's other important details about how this is implemented, how to optimize these types of models that are important to know if you actually want to implement this, but are maybe less conceptually important for understanding how it works. And so it's if you're interested in this, it's worth checking out the original paper on this. So the loss function for WaveNet is very similar to the loss function that you'll use for a lot of other classification tasks, which is you're just trying to minimize the log likelihood of the outputs given the inputs. This is what this looks like in in math. And the way that you'd actually implement this is you'd break it out, right? So Y is your sequence of outputs. And so you decompose this into a log likelihood on each of the individual outputs, not just, and that's how you'd actually compute this. And each of those log likelihoods is just your standard cross-entropy loss. So one other thing that's worth mentioning, just because I think it's pretty important to understanding how a lot of these really successful large production language models and text-to-speech models and other big deep learning models work, is that one of the keys to make them work really well is that they tend to use massive data sets that are not necessarily publicly available. And so this is true for the WaveNet paper. And it used internal Google sets, Google data sets that maybe are not that many hours of speech, but have many, many samples per second. So these, at the time in 2016, were huge data sets. And now the models that do this are much, much larger, and they're trained on way more data than this. So in order to make this work, so in order to make training on these humongous data sets work, there's, as you can imagine, a bunch of tricks that go into doing this training. But you might imagine wrong. And that's kind of one of the amazing things about the WaveNet paper, which is that since WaveNet training can be done in parallel, there weren't a ton of complicated tricks that were needed in order to train these models. Just really, basically parallelize it on GPUs. On the other hand, inference on these models is very tricky, right? Because you at each time step in the output, right? And these time steps are very small. They're a small fraction of a second. You need to compute stuff that depends on potentially long sequence of input. And so actually doing inference on these models is very expensive. So even though training is simple, inference on these models is complicated. And there was actually a separate paper, a second paper that was introduced that had some ideas about how to do more efficient inference on the WaveNet architecture. Okay, so to summarize, WaveNet approach. So WaveNet, or these kinds of convolutional sequence models, are another way of dealing with long-term dependencies. And the way that we deal with long-term dependencies is we just say, you know what, recurrent neural networks don't deal with long-term dependencies well, so let's just get rid of recurrent neural networks. And instead, we're going to use a one-dimensional form of convolution. So convolution in the sense that each output is produced by looking at a window of inputs. And in particular, the types of 1D convolutions that we'll use are causal convolutions. So where the windows of inputs that we're using to predict the next output depend only on the past and not on the future. And that's important if we want to be able to do inference on these kinds of networks in real time. And then to increase the receptive field of these causal convolutions, so if if a particular output depends on a wide range of input data, then we can dilate these convolutions so that each output looks at a wider array of inputs. And then, in addition to like handling these longer term dependencies more gracefully and more effectively in practice, the other big advantage of WaveNet is that it's just inherently parallel to train. And so training it is very fast and doesn't require many tricks. But the trade-off that you make when you implement a model like this is these models are slow at inference time, because the next time step that you're trying to compute depends on values computed from all of the past. And so there's some work that needs to go into making these models usable for online inference, if that's your goal.